What do Wildcats, Bulldogs, and Cavaliers have in common? They all claim our guest as one of their own. That's right. Our guest has graduated from Yale, Northwestern, and Virginia. But you can now find her teaching sociology at Westmont College in Santa Barbara. Outside of school, this serial monotasker shapes up her garden and thinks about how technology is shaping all of us. She's not a bass player just yet, but she is an accomplished author of multiple books, most recently Restless Devices. She may be small in stature, but she is a giant in this category. Gang, please join me in saying hi, Felicia, to our guest, Felicia Wu Song.
Thanks.
Felicia, so good to see you.
Thanks so much, Joey. That was awesome. I've never heard all those mascots put together before. So it's great to be with you.
Well, I actually had this thought. I was thinking about how proud my parents would have been for me to just graduate from one of those, and you went ahead and knocked out all three, and just made the rest of us look a lot worse for it.
Oh no!
So
no,
well
no.
done. What's the Westmont College mascot? I left that mascot out.
It is a warrior.
The Warriors. I like that. So you're a Wildcat, Bulldog, Cavalier, and Warrior. I love it. Oh, that's great. Well, thank you very much. I've been a big fan of yours from afar for a while. We both spoke at the Think conference, and I've heard you speak there before, and just such a thought leader in this category. So I'm excited to talk to you. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
So you've been, you talk a lot about how technology is shaping us. I mentioned that a little bit in the intro, and you've been thinking about that for a long time. I mean, even since the 90s, when email came out, and then you talked about it in Virtual Communities, your book in 2009. So I'm curious about this topic. And again, we think about this a lot too, but sometimes I sit back and I think, okay, is this just the progression? Is this just how things work? I mean, we had emails that changed the way we communicated. We have social media now. Everything changes. So is this the progression? Is this just the natural progression of the technology? And maybe a different way of asking it is it even worth resisting?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, we could have a whole conversation about natural progressions.
I'd love to. Let's do it.
I think that there's nothing. Well, there is little that is actually natural about technology and how it innovates and shifts, and that it is actually a myth that our society accepts when we accept the myth of its inevitability. So I think there's certainly ways in which we can say, oh, it makes sense that we move from, say, the telegraph, right? A form of very simple communication that then moves to radio. You add on the audio, and then you get the camera, right? And then you get the visual, right? And we can walk through, the history of movies and television and so forth. So there's a kind of perceived naturalness to adding on these different features, right, of communication, information technologies. But in terms of what form it actually takes when it encounters us as consumers or users, to me, that is never natural, right? So say like the telephone didn't start off as a point-to-point conversation. People didn't call one person, it was actually a party line in the beginning. It was like you called into it was like the early chat room party line. And then eventually the technology evolved because people were like, no, I just want to talk to one person. And that evolved. And so, and there were companies, right? There's business industries that were invested in that. And so we ramped that up from email to the internet. It's like the internet of 1990s, right, is nothing like the internet of 2023, right? Soon 2024. And some of that might be perceived as kind of natural progressions, right? You tack on different sorts of features to make it more complex compared to the old school email, right? But in terms of why social media looks the way it does and comes to us the way it does, or why streaming entertainment is structured the way it is, right? None of that is determinative. None of that is inevitable. Those are business models. Those are decisions being made
Oh,
by tech industry, by media industries, right? And so all of those are, to me, decisions that have been made along the way that do
mm,
create some degrees of sort of natural progressions, that adaptations that you keep building on. But all those kind of major decisions didn't have to be that way. Can still be changed, right?
hmm,
Certainly gets harder and harder to change once certain kinds of structures and models get concretized, kind of
yeah,
crystallized in our society. But, this is a very typical sociological perspective, which is that our landscape, our institutional landscape is constructed, right? It is socially
yeah,
constructed. People, companies, powers made decisions to construct the landscape that we live, the media landscape that we experience. Um, and those decisions had incentives, they had agendas, right? They made sense in particular
hmm,
times. And each of those sense making logics don't have to, right, be
yeah.
inevitable.
See, I like that distinction because it's almost thinking about it the way you framed it. It's almost like nutrition. It's like I think, and correct me if I'm wrong. I think what I'm hearing is our need for nutrition, if in the physical, has not changed. It's just what we're being fed is different. But we're being fed something different. That doesn't mean that it's not like our bodies have evolved
Mm,
or progressed to the point where we no longer need all of our vitamins and minerals,
mm,
right? And
mm,
so, to your point here, is that we're just being fed something different. It's not necessarily something natural. And so, are we? So maybe the question was, is resistance futile? But and so is it? But that is what we're getting fed,
mm,
and that is. So do we? At what point does someone
mm-hmm,
begin to adapt to their environment versus fighting that environment? Adapt to, hey, this is just how thing. I hear this a lot with my kids who are 15 and 13. People say, well, no, this is just how kids just communicate on Snapchat now. That's just how they do
yeah.
it. So at what point do we
Mm,
accept that? And then at what point do we push back on that?
okay. Yeah. Yeah. So I think um, uh, the prospects of resistance being futile is just depressing to me. It's not a place I can go, and it gets me back into, if your listeners are old enough, right, remembering the resistance is futile Borg line. All of that
Right.
is just
Yes,
very
exactly.
sad and depressing.
It is sad.
So I think there is a degree of empathy that needs to
Hmm.
be exercised um, when we take into consideration what the contemporary dynamic, you mentioned your kids, right? What the contemporary dynamics are. I think
Hmm.
it's super important, right? To really live into that and deeply understand what are the dynamics of communication and relationship and
Hmm.
information consumption now, right? Especially for our
Yeah.
young people who this is all they've ever known, right? Um, but this is where I think understanding or learning about history, reading about
Hmm.
people who lived in different times or in different cultures is super helpful to realize that, oh, other people lived differently at another time or another place.
Hmm.
And there were good things about that, and maybe there were bad things about that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But that as human beings, um, we need to attend to not just what we're given, shall we say, in a society in a
Hmm.
given time, but we need to attend to certain realities about our being human, our being people, right? That there
Hmm.
may be some universal aspects that trace through time, trace across cultures, right, that we need to pay attention to. And if it is a fact that our contemporary dynamics of how we talk to each other, how we get information, how we take time off, right? All the accepted, normalized ways are actually not, you talked about nutrition, not feeding us, right? Not helping
Mm,
us grow as people, as human beings. Then we need to kind of sit up and say, all right, maybe I need to think about or figure out how to do something differently from what my
yeah.
culture is telling me. And maybe I need to consider, how do I have that kind of relationship that I read about at another time, or have that way of understanding the world, knowledge, right? That this other
Mm,
culture seems to exhibit. And so that's where I think it is needing to have an imagination, right? About like how
yeah.
things could be different and knowing that it
Hmm.
has been different, or it is different in other places, that helps us realize, oh, okay, maybe resistance is worthwhile, right? It is worthwhile
Yeah.
because of the benefits that come with, say, growing into a kind of person that I actually want to become.
Yeah. I, I I can picture that in my mind as you're describing, and it's you refer in the book in Restless Devices to getting a little bit of a taste of that,
Hmm.
to just getting a little bit of taste of what that feels like. Will you talk some about this idea of maybe what we have become, and let's maybe start it from, and a lot of people, I don't you I had written this question down, then I said, then I read it in the book as well. It's almost like we can't remember what life was like,
Hmm.
and which is there are a couple of elements of that. One of them is you almost don't want to look back with two rose colored glasses on like everything was great then,
Right.
but there were some, you talk about these commonalities across time. What are some of those things? Can you describe, maybe for me, even though I lived it, but others, like what did that life look like before all this came in, before the mid 90s email, which kind of began to change our communication? What was that life like that you believe is worth trying to recapture today?
Hmm. Yeah. So in the 90s, the internet was something that was literally connected to the wall. And so when you were online, you were in one place, whether it was work or at home. It wasn't moving with you. You weren't carrying it on you all the time. And
Right.
so what that meant was when you were not at your desk, you were in a meeting, you were talking to people, you were walking through your day, and the only option you had was to um, go through your day as it was. You didn't have a streaming kind of social media account to be thinking about. You weren't thinking, right? You didn't. There weren't other things happening. Um,
Hmm.
it was, you were more present, I think. It's not to
Hmm.
say that people weren't distracted through the ages or preoccupied. Surely we are have always been capable of being that in as human beings. But there was just less, right?
Hmm.
Less um, things to be um, dedicating our kind of psychic energy to.
Hmm.
And so I think we were more present, we were more in our bodies. And in all of it, again, was because we didn't have choices, right? Like when you were exercising, I guess in the 90s, we had, like Walkmans and things
Walkmans.
like that. In the 80s, yeah. But, even before that, it's like if you went on a hike, you went on a hike, or you went on a run, you
Hmm.
went on a run. There was nothing to listen to, right?
Yeah.
Or you can talk to people. So I think there are ways in which, and again, it's not to say that I love listening to podcasts, like this. It's not to
Yeah.
say there aren't wonderful things that come from being able to listen or being able to multitask, right? All of these are incredible benefits. There's good things that come out of it. But I think it has shifted, right? It's the availability of choices,
Yeah.
availability even of maybe we feel pressures, demands to always be
Mm.
available to people, right?
Yeah.
Always responding to a text. Um, um, I always laugh with my college students about how I did college. That we had my first year, I lived with five other women in a suite in a dorm, and we had one answering machine for our phone.
Right.
And so we talk about like how hilarious it was when you made plans with people, with friends, right?
Gosh.
You would make a plan and you would say, we're gonna meet at this corner and we're gonna go do whatever, right? And then sometimes you would just be waiting there forever, right? Like, and you kind of give yourself like a 20-minute, 30-minute thing. But if they didn't show up, they didn't show up. And then you're like, okay, I guess I got to go do something else, right? Or you just had to be there like that, and
Yeah.
that was it. There was no like back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, which we do now.
Right.
And then the whole answering machine story is hilarious because with six women getting messages from all sorts of people that we all got to listen in on each other's social lives. Like we weren't all close friends, but it's like you
Right.
just be sitting there waiting, for possibly your message, and then it might not never come because maybe nobody called you.
Right.
And that was just like it was slower, frustrating
Mm.
sometimes,
Yeah.
um, inefficient, yes, right? But arguably, something I've become interested in more is what arguably more of a human level
Mm.
pace or a human
Mm.
scale. Um, I haven't quite found the words yet, but I've become interested in wondering, are we maxing out with our technologies and our communications
Uh,
these days? Are we maxing out, like, is the inflow of texts and the requirements to respond, is it outstripping just our
mm.
human psychic capacity, right, to be engaged, right, in the ways that we want to be?
Yeah.
And I think, we can ask that question of information. We could ask that question of entertainment, all of this, like, are we just kind of going beyond what we
Yeah.
can neurologically process, what we can psychically, emotionally process? Maybe
Mm.
we're just kind of, like we're tapping out.
It feels that way. I mean, I think
Mm,
I like that. I would love for you to continue to just as your brain's working on things that
mm,
human level pace.
mm,
What an interesting concept. It's almost like we're trying to match the machines and we just can't. We're not designed to. It's not really great to. And you're right, you can start to struggle through. I think about I think about the I was thinking back to the 90s and about arranging plans. I had a friend drop me off 2 hours from my house to meet a friend who was going the other way. And we just literally said, hey, let's meet at that gas station
right.
off the highway
Yeah.
in a place that in a city that had like 14 exits. I said that one guess. And so we're calling this, it's a too long of a story, but calling the same voicemail, leaving voicemails on the same one that we can both check. It was just a hilarious thing. And good news is I made it. So I'm still here. So but it built this kind of level of resourcefulness and almost to a way where you think, okay, I'm not going to do it that way next time. It almost
Mm-hmm.
gave you the
Mm-hmm.
mistakes you can kind of fix and build a resourcefulness and the resilience all around that. It's so interesting. And then I even think about, I think I have, in this, or your old memory box, I have all these old letters from friends. We used to
Mm-hmm.
write letters.
Yep.
And I didn't grow up in,
Yeah.
it's not like you and I grew up in like the early 1900s. This was just a few years ago
Right.
when we were writing letters. And it's so meaningful to have that
Yeah.
physical artifact
Mm-hmm.
of someone encouraging
Mm-hmm.
you at such a young age.
Mm-hmm.
It's such an interesting concept. And maybe that dovetails into what you talk about, this whole concept going to technology. You say in the book, all of the little habits those urges to check our phones, to check our platforms, those are shaping us. What do you will you talk about that? What it means that we've been shaped by them? How are these things shaping us? What are we becoming?
Mm, yeah. Well, your example about writing letters is great because I think about how letters are wonderful to hold on to as a recipient. But as a writer of letters, um, it requires I mean, you have to sit down, right? Like you
Yeah.
sit down and your thoughts can only go as fast as you can write. Um,
Hmm.
and so I have always found that writing letters brings me into a different place
Huh.
inside of me in my interior life.
Yeah.
It requires me to reflect. It requires me to move out beyond the sort of surface kind of, oh, this is what I did today, kind of like documenting, to
Yeah.
more of a processing, emotional, reflective level. And the brain science is super interesting about how that's actually tapping into different parts of our brains
Wow.
when we engage those different kinds of thoughts. But
Hmm.
I think, to the point, to your question about what our constant tapping away at our screens does is that it 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 trains us, right? Because our technologies are with us all the time. Um, it trains us to start to exist in a state of a kind of surface responsiveness, right?
Hmm.
And that we are always, um, 1/100th of us is dedicated to where we actually are, and the 99 is distributed to all the other texts and conversations or Google searches we want to engage in. And so we're kind of fractured in our psyche.
Hmm.
um, I know we often talk about, or people talk about the way we're distracted or that our attention, right, is fractured. I think that's probably all true. To me, it's not just kind of attention, but it is an interiority, right? That when you are
Hmm.
constantly being asked to respond to something, right? There's a way in which you don't get a chance to
Hmm.
be alone, to be quiet, to build up a kind of interiority of understanding what is it that I actually think about
Hmm.
something, right? So it's like if something happens in the news and you go online and you read a whole lot about it, right? There's a lot of voices, a lot of noise. It's very confusing, right? And if we
Hmm.
don't give ourselves enough time, enough places, ways to take it all in and just let it sink in us
Hmm.
long enough, we don't ever come to figure out what we think, right? We just kind of
Wow.
parrot maybe something that seemed interesting that we heard or that someone that we respect on some, feed, happened to say, right? But we never really kind of let it sift through all of us.
Hmm.
And so I think um, it is the ways that we are training our bodies, right? And this is where I turn to a Augustinian framework of how we are formed, right, as people, that we aren't
Hmm.
just formed with information, beliefs,
Right.
things that we
Yeah.
know, but we are formed the way athletes and musicians and artists are formed, right? We are training our bodies to become a certain kind of person, a certain way of perceiving, right? I just think of like a baseball player who's just learning to hit, right? And like
Yeah.
their perception, right? Their capacity to perceive how fast that ball is coming, where it is being formed from those thousands and thousands, right, of training hours. And so if we are investing thousands of hours pecking away at our devices, right?
Yeah.
That's training us, right? It's training our bodies to perceive what's even happening, right? In
Hmm.
a different way. So for example, you mentioned that I'm a serial monotasker in the intro,
Which I love
right?
that term.
That's great. I love that. We're gonna have to steal that one from you. Is right. Like it's when we're so used to multitasking, right? You're just
Hmm.
fixated on the different things that you have decided you're going to do. But when you're monotasking, you're only doing one thing. Suddenly, because we are created with such incredible capacities to perceive, we're interrupted. We suddenly realize other things are happening actually that I wasn't
Hmm.
noticing before. And maybe those things were actually really worthwhile. And I'm so glad I didn't miss it.
Hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it is this sense of like, um, a question I'm constantly raising is what are we missing, right, with our
Hmm.
technological lives? What are we not even noticing is happening um, when we are drawn into the screen or feeling pressure to constantly respond to what's happening on our screens?
The concept of monotasking I love, and that's you can have serial monotask because you came up with monotasking. So I think it's safe to say that's yours. But if you ever if anybody's ever done like a little bit of a mindfulness
Mhm.
exercise of just isolating the senses,
Yeah.
um, I have found so far in maybe 50 times of doing that, and when you're outside and you get to the hearing part, the hearing is my favorite of all of them
Mm.
because I guarantee you'll hear a bird no matter where you
Mhm.
are. When you're outside, you will hear a bird, and it's an interesting exercise because if you would have said to me, Joey, what are you missing when you're walking?
Yeah.
I would have had no idea what I was missing because I was missing it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, but when you do take a moment, like you said, just to get a little bit of taste of what's out there, it's a really beautiful experience, and it can be extraordinarily kind of jarring and unnerving and uncomfortable through all of that. Have you found maybe as you've begun to practice or as you practice kind of monotasking or anything like that, do you find a level of discomfort as you kind of wrestle through the exercise?
Oh, for sure. The beginning is always
Yeah.
the worst. It's terrible. I mean,
That's good to hear.
it's all the classic withdrawal symptom stuff that you read about
Mm,
when people are addicted and they're trying to get off of whatever their, substance or behavioral addiction is. And so it's sometimes it's feeling anxious, right? Sometimes it's like physically sweating, right? You're kind of like you're
mm,
like my body needs to be doing something that is not this. And um but I think, I as we've been talking, I've been thinking about how um one of the things that our technologies gives us is it gives us a profound sense of control,
mm,
right? That we can control our days, we can control how people perceive us, we can control, we can very much control how we express ourselves or how we appear to the world, right? So
mm,
there's a lot of control that our digital technologies grant us these days. When we start to resist the habits, right? When we start to resist these practices, when we start to try monotasking or mindfulness, right, exercises, I think part of what is so uncomfortable is that we are letting go of control. We are
mm,
letting go of the control we try to exercise over our attention, you know, um, or what we allow into our kind of perceptions, our sensory modes, right? Um, and when we're not in control, when you start paying it, when I'm not just looking at my emails when I'm at the grocery store at the checkout line, right? When I'm not just banging through it, but I'm actually opening myself up to
mm.
the presence of the other people that are standing in line in front of me or in back of me.
Hmm.
then I'm opening myself up to not being in control, because maybe that person next to me wants to actually say hello, right? Or maybe
Yeah.
they're actually really sad and I can sense that, right?
Mm.
Or they're kind of just overwhelmed. Maybe there's a mom with just three little kids who are just acting up, and she just needs a little sympathy,
Mm.
a kind word. Then I'm not in control, so to speak, anymore. I'm open to other beings, other
Yeah.
realities that are at work around me. And I think it's that's scary, right? That requires often something of me, that I
Mm.
might not feel like giving. Um, but I think it is when we give up control and we realize, oh, there are bigger things happening than my life.
Mm.
There are bigger things happening than what's in my email, right?
Yeah.
It reproportions. It recalibrates me, actually, in
Mm.
a really good and important way, right?
Mm.
And it reminds me that I'm not in control, and I shouldn't be in control, right?
Yeah.
Like full control. That's just not the reality of things,
Yeah.
right? And if you're a person of faith, you may have a particular understanding, right, of saying,
Yeah.
actually, I get to live in God's universe, and there's a
Hmm.
lot of other things happening, and I'm just hanging out in my little place in it, a
Yeah.
little pin in it, but there's a lot going on, and maybe I need to participate in that in a
Mm.
kind of citizen communal way, not in a I'm just going to drive my little road, do my little thing, and everybody get out of my
Yeah.
way kind of way of living.
That's a pretty profound thought. And I'm thinking back to the very, very first question that I had about this natural progression. And it is when you said the technology is, you have this, it's kind of this myth of inevitability and what's natural. What is natural is exactly what you said, is the fact that we are on a big rock hurling through the universe with no level of control. I mean, what's natural is to recognize that we
Mm,
don't have control. It's natural to be out of control. And what you said at the very beginning of that statement was you had this sense of, you emphasize sense, this sense of control, or
mhm,
technology giving us a sense of the control that we have. Um, and so we go through almost not really recognizing how out of control we are. And if you can, to some degree, to your point, you really can embrace that and just see the chaos around you and understand that you can actually bring in you can bring a little bit of order
mhm,
into somebody else's life doing exactly what you said. I mean,
mhm,
how far could a word of encouragement go to you, like you said, to a mom who is getting run over at the at the grocery store by her kids? Um, that's a pretty beautiful idea and way to live. Um, the other thought that I had related to that is we flee this when you talk about going into silence or going into a place where you're not distracting yourself, or you're able to kind of observe observe what's happening around you, is that we feel this anxiousness. You described an anxiousness that you can feel in that.
mhm,
And it's almost like the core belief that we have behind that is that anxiousness is bad.
mhm,
And I'm not sure that's true, right? Maybe like an anxiousness may be just kind of working out,
mhm,
like working something bad out, right?
mhm,
Working, you got to, and if you lean away from it,
mhm,
then you're not actually able to process that. It's almost like C.S. Lewis talks about God would be a bad surgeon I think he says, if he yielded to your entreaties and stopped surgery mid surgery just because it was painful,
mhm,
right?
mhm,
But
mhm,
what if he said a good surgeon hears your cries and continues on through the surgery,
mhm,
right?
mhm,
That kind of going through that pain, that discomfort and anxiousness. By the way, I'm saying all of this all theoretically.
mhm.
Something's gonna happen tonight, and I'm gonna just completely flee anxiousness. So it's such an easy thing to say in theory, but that's a very long-winded way to say that
Yeah.
it's almost as if we're walking through life with this core belief that pain and anxiousness
Mhm,
and discomfort are bad.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, and I think our technologies our contemporary technologies are all built to advance that idea, right?
Hmm.
That there are ways to escape the anxiety. So
Yeah.
if you're feeling anxious, just watch this TV show. If you're feeling anxious, just
Hmm.
get get to your email, zero inbox, right?
Yeah.
There's whatever it is. No, 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 I know I'm slamming all the zero inbox people. But um,
I'm an aspiring zero inboxer. Just
oh, yeah,
aspiring.
no, that's not even.
You
You
gave
don't want
up.
to look at my inbox. I'm in the thousands club.
Oh
Um,
boy.
um, but I think, there's interesting. I hear psychologists starting to talk about how anxiety is something that is actually a healthy signal for us of what we care about,
Hmm.
which is
Oh,
interesting,
that's interesting.
right? So if you're feeling anxious before an exam or a competition, what does that tell you? It doesn't tell you that you are going to fail and you're incompetent and that you're not a whole person. Actually, it tells you that you actually care a lot about what you're going to engage in, and so
I love
you
that.
feel some pressure there. Um, and obviously, with that said, there are certainly a lot of people that experience levels of anxiety that are not productive, right? When it really
Yeah.
goes beyond what is healthy and going to be generative for them. So that's something that clearly needs tending to.
Right.
But in general, kind of like run of the mill anxiety, right, is, as you said, actually a really healthy um, kind of physiological response to something that we maybe need to grow into meeting, right, and engaging.
Yeah.
And so I was actually thinking when you were mentioning your road trip, it made me think about how I took a road trip from New England down to Virginia back in the 90s in my little hatchback. And my poor mom was very anxious because, we didn't have cell phones. And so I would call her at gas stations with my little phone card,
Right.
every couple hours when I took a pit stop. And um, as a parent, I'm sure for my mom, she was terrified, right? It was my first solo
Yeah.
trip. She didn't know what was going to happen to her daughter. She didn't know anything about the South. As someone from New England who knows what happens in the South, right? And so she was anxious. So she was always very thankful, right? And so nowadays, parents don't have to be anxious, right? Because you could just like watch your child drive
Yeah.
down on the dot, right? Or you can
You
text,
don't even need to talk
yeah,
to
right.
them, right?
You can
Yeah.
text them at any moment and be angry if they haven't responded to you, right? There's wonderful things about the ways in which one can surveil one's child, right, when they go off into some very far off land. And that can be very reassuring. Totally understandable as a parent. I feel that way also. But at the same time, that road trip for me was so
Hmm.
pivotal for me growing as a person, right? Yeah, I was anxious. I wasn't sure what was going to happen during those 300, 400 some odd miles, right? I
Yeah.
had to think about what's going to happen if I blow a tire. What happens if, right? Like I had to ponder all those things as I'm driving. And
Yeah.
so there's ways in which that anxiety I was experiencing before and even during the trip um, was important for me to work through to
Mm.
gain confidence, right? And kind of push through and be like, okay, no, I have plans, right? I have planned, if something happens, here's what I'm going to do. There's plan A. If that doesn't work, then I got to do plan B, right? Like I had to work all that out and become a different kind of person by the time I got to Virginia,
Yeah.
right?
Wow.
And then and so it's just a different and it was because I had no choices, right? We didn't have choices then. I just had my
Yeah.
little phone card and hoped that I could get to a gas station if I was stuck in the middle of nowhere, right? Now we have choices. We have lots of resources, again, that are wonderful, but it
Hmm.
makes it hard, right? It makes it hard
Yes.
to put yourself, you have to intentionally, like you're saying, you have to intentionally put yourself in places that are quiet, that are alone, that are right, anxiety
Mm.
producing per se, right? You have to
Yeah.
make those choices, and that is strange, right? That's
Mm.
strange in a world that is like, why would you do that? Right?
Yeah.
Like, that's so
Right.
weird.
Yeah.
You know, like
Yeah.
it's more efficient, it's more satisfying. Why would you choose something
Mm.
else? But again,
And it,
it's the longer goal.
and it's that personhood that you talk about in the book. It really is. They like kind of becoming that. I want to. I want to talk just in the last section here about. You talk about the pathways of meaningful resistance. What those things that you do, and you have the Freedom Project, which is great within the book
Mhm.
for people who need to go pick up the book. The kind of these questions and the experiments and things like that. Will you talk about if someone is hearing this? And we've given a couple different, you've given a couple different things, but and they want to just begin the practice. They want to, where do I begin? What are some of these little bits of resistance that I can start to implement into my life where maybe I'm not as toggled to my devices or whatever that is? What are some practical things that people can begin to do to start forming that resistance for themselves?
Yeah. Well, so I am a proponent of really small things. I'm
Mm.
not one that says, you're going to have to square out 3 days and go on a digital detox because I think most of us can't afford 3 days.
Right.
um, and so to me, it starts with like 15 minutes, right? Maybe it
Mm.
looks like 15 minutes at the beginning of your day if you're someone who when you wake up and your alarm is on your phone and you check it and you're just like hit with the weight of
Yeah.
the world, right? And you
Mm.
know this is no way for me to wake up every day. So maybe it's just 15 minutes of I'm gonna go buy an alarm clock. That's not connected to my phone, and that's what's gonna be next to my bed. And when I get up, I'm gonna go make my coffee. I'm gonna go stretch. I'm gonna go journal. I'm gonna read a devotional. I'm gonna meditate. Whatever it is, just for 15 minutes, just to ground myself. Maybe you do that at
Mm.
night, right? Um, maybe you just need those 15 minutes. So I think, wherever it is that the pain point is for us, whether
Yeah.
it's like, oh man, I'm waking up and I'm stressed, or I can't get to sleep because I'm like, keep on reading
Mm.
stuff or watching videos, right? Whatever that pain point is, we can start with just these small times. I call them sacred times that we block out and we say, no, this is sacred for my rest. This is sacred for my own well-being, right? It's sacred for the time I spend with my loved one, right?
Yeah.
Just this little bit. And there can be sacred places, maybe
Mm.
this room, right? We will not have certain kinds of devices, right, that will continually beep and notify that it needs my attention, right? Um, or maybe I go to, so we might have rooms in our house and Arrow is perfect, right? You can put your devices in a certain place and be like, okay, you're over there. But maybe it's outside of our house. Maybe we go to a
Yeah.
sacred place, right? Maybe we go
Mm.
to that tree on the hill, right? Where we've been blessed with full dreams and thoughts there before. So we go there, right?
Mm.
We devote ourselves to going there once a week or 3 times a week, without our devices, right?
Yeah.
And so it is about these little practices that we can try, that give us, as you've been mentioning, kind of a taste of something different. And in the beginning, it might feel uncomfortable because it's not our habit. Yeah, our bodies are not used to it. But I encourage people to kind of lean into it. Give yourself, like, I'm just going to try this for 2 weeks, you know?
Yeah.
And then if it really still stinks by 2 weeks, maybe we dial back or adjust, and that's fine, right? That's totally fine. But that's what I mean by, thinking about meaningful resistance and not just prescribing something to
Yeah.
everyone. I think we're all different, right? We all kind of have our different propensities, our different places of pain or weakness or limitation. And so it
Mm.
does require a little bit of kind of self reflection and
Yeah.
honesty, right? And courage to say, hey, I'm just going to
Yes.
try this. Maybe it's not going to work, but I'm going to just commit myself for a short period of time, um, and see how it goes, and maybe that's just deleting an app, for a couple,
Hmm.
for a week, whatever that app of choices of yours, and just switching it up and learning, something different, like you said, hearing the birds and being like, oh my gosh, I didn't know there were birds in my neighborhood, right? Or for some of us, it's the, oh, what is that plant? I didn't even know that plant. What
Hmm.
is that plant? Or, oh, it's really fuzzy. Like, how delightful.
Yeah.
So really getting back into our bodies, I think, is
Hmm.
always a part of the kind of resistance that moves us forward.
Yeah. And I've heard people talk about there's some debate, are we addicted to our technology, or do we have a bad set of habits around them? I like the second one because it I feel like we have a little bit more agency over it.
Mhm.
But one argument I've heard against it being a real addiction is that we actually adapt pretty quickly once we. I think that's, for the listener, one thing you'll find. I believe, and this has been my experience, when I make a little change like that, like the 15 minutes in the morning,
Mhm.
I didn't have a cold sweat. It was kind of fine. It's like we adapt pretty quickly. We
Mhm.
don't actually have all the withdrawals we might think we do.
Mhm.
So I think what you've just laid out, these small little practices, and I love the idea of sacred times. I love, but sacred places, I really really like that.
Mhm.
Just like this is that place. And beginning for 15 minutes, this is something that's readily accessible to everybody listening.
Mhm.
I believe we all have 15 minutes, right?
Mhm.
Especially when we look at our screen time report on Sundays. um, I'm curious for. I want to close with this question: the next generation of kids,
Mhm.
and the for someone who's listening with very young kids, or maybe doesn't even have kids
Mhm.
yet, it's a lot easier to initiate good behavior than change bad behavior.
Mhm.
So, what would be, maybe if you had one little silver
Mhm.
bullet for somebody, for how do I train this up in the next generation of kids? How do I
Mhm.
actually change the trajectory of where things are going, to help our kids not have to go recover
Mhm.
personhood,
Mhm.
but go initiate personhood and not lose it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, I think it is all about cultivating loves for what is available in our natural world and in community. It is
Mm-hmm.
about introducing our children to music, to being outdoors, to using their bodies, playing sports or cooking, right? All, being with relatives or
Mm.
neighbors, just hanging out on the porch, right? Like all these fairly mundane
Yeah.
activities that we might think of as a part of childhood, um, that can be cultivated in a way that become real loves for our kids, right? So that whatever that technology is going to be, like if you don't have kids right now, who knows what it's going to be, in
Right.
15 years. Um, the point is, you've begun to lay down a foundation of
Mm.
of appetites for things that are beautiful in the world, that might be good, right? So
Mm.
maybe it is serving your community in some way, right? Maybe it is helping to think about the environment or looking to the vulnerable populations in your
Mm.
community and being with them, right? Cultivating this wider world of interactions, giving them a sense of, oh, there's this beautiful thing, there's this good thing, there's this true thing that I'm capable of engaging. And then
Mm.
whatever the technologies are, hopefully they become a part of it, right? They become of the good, a
Yeah.
part of the beauty, a part of the truth. It doesn't come in, maybe it does come in competition to it, but when it does come in competition, then there's always still that memory, right? That
Yeah.
root memory of, oh no, I knew there was something good about spending time alone, sitting under that tree, right?
Yeah.
Looking at the bugs, right? That was really awesome. And that's always going to be a part of them, no matter what technologies
Mm.
come.
What a great, beautiful thing. To way to end it is in our kids cultivating a love for what is good and beautiful. That's quite a picture. And and what's neat about it is that's not ethereal. It's not Pollyanna. That is possible.
Mm-hmm.
And we're, and again, not to overly quote C.S. Lewis, but it's almost like that we're far too easily pleased. I think
Mm-hmm.
we're far too easily pleased with what's in our pocket versus what's all around us.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I would love people to go to FeliciaWuSong.com. Please do order a copy of Restless Devices. It's such a great, it's what I love about it, Felicia, is it's academic, but it's also kind of, as people hear you talk here, it's also just like, it's beautiful language, and it's you kind of start seeing and feeling all the things you're describing, and what it feels like to recover personhood, presence, and place. So thank
Thank
you. Very grateful. Thank you for joining us. This is a big get for us here, Felicia. You're big time. So we're we're appreciative of you
you.
coming and hanging out with
So
us.
sweet. Yeah, thanks. No, I really appreciate the invitation, and it's just been such a pleasure getting to know you and learning more about what you all do.
Thanks so much, Felicia.